Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the DDS Joint Forum for our community members as well as our providers. I'm Winslow Woodland, Deputy Director for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. And if I seem to be speaking slowly, it's to ensure that our interpreters can actually keep up with me. So it's not that I'm trying to sound robotic, but I want to respect our interpreters. So we have a really full agenda today. So let me just jump right in. We'll get started with our COVID data. As soon as that pulls up, I'll go through the COVID data. But essentially, we haven't had any changes from last month, which we're very happy to report. No new cases, no hospitalizations. One new case, no hospitalization.
We are still at 810 because that one person who contracted COVID in July had it previously. That's why the number is the same, but we did have one person with COVID. Sorry.
So if you heard that, I'll repeat it. Thank you. That we did have one person who tested positive, so the numbers did go up, but no new people. So as you can see, our little spiky chart that we have here, and we're very happy that we seem to be in a good place as it relates to COVID, particularly with people contracting it not requiring medical attention or hospitalization. And the breakdown of our placements, we've gone over consistently for a period of time, and as you can see, nothing has changed from our last month's meeting. And no new hospitalizations, which we hope continues to be the pattern. And no one who's contracted COVID has expired. Thank you. All right, so we are closing out Disability Pride Month. We're very pleased to share some information with you on Disability Pride. Next slide, please. And I thought that the sharing of the proclamation in honor of Disability Pride Month, the mayor has signed the proclamation and it is posted on our website for those who want to probably see it. And if you could make that just a little bit larger for me, I'll read it for those who could benefit from me reading it. Whereas each year, the month of July is designated in Washington, D.C. as Disability Pride Month, a time to, not so fast, a time to recognize, honor, and celebrate the accomplishments, resilience, and diverse abilities of individuals with disabilities. And whereas Disability Pride Month serves as an opportunity to raise awareness about the challenges faced by people with disabilities and to promote inclusivity, equality, and accessibility in all aspects of society. And whereas individuals with disabilities contribute significantly to our communities, enriching our society with their unique perspectives, talents, and skills, and deserve to be celebrated and valued for their important contributions. And whereas Disability Pride Month seeks to challenge societal misconceptions and stereotypes associated with disabilities, fostering a culture of acceptance, understanding, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their abilities. And whereas it is essential to create inclusive environments to empower individuals with disabilities to participate in all aspects of life, including education, employment, healthcare, and community engagement, among others. And whereas by promoting Disability Pride Month and recognizing the rights of individuals with disabilities, we can work towards building a more equitable and accessible society that embraces diversity and promotes equal opportunities for all. Now, therefore, I, Mayor of Washington, D.C., and I am not the Mayor of Washington, D.C., I'm just reading the proclamation, do hereby proclaim the month of July 2023 as Disability Pride Month in Washington, D.C., and do commend this observance to all Washingtonians. Signed, the Honorable Muriel E. Bowser. Thank you. Now we need to make this a little smaller. So I thought that it would be interesting, and we're going to post this to just discuss that in March of 1990, a large group of people marched to the White House. I'm from the White House to the Capitol for the purposes of advocating for their rights. And there were displays of civil disobedience, and ultimately those actions, we believe firmly, led to the rapid signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide, please. And, so here I just talk about the experience, the concept of disability pride. And I just wanted to note that many believe that the movement is a very significant movement, and that it has led to and added a richness to how civil disobedience and movements where people are seeking their rights have, benefited from those who put themselves firmly out there in public. And so what I am going to do is to share a short video. It's about 8 minutes. And when I first came across this video, I was so excited because it's a video that is done by a young person who, for my opinion, did an excellent job encapsulating the history of the movement. And I just have to say that the language used in this video may not be to the standard of today with regard to some of the words you'll hear, but none of it, from my opinion, is offensive. So if we could just jump right into the video. And the video will be closed captioned, so the interpreters will not be interpreting the video. Sound.
We can't hear it.
Capitol building. They all have the Capitol crawl, taking a crawl in history. On March 12, 1990, disability rights activists gathered by the U.S. Capitol building. They all had the same goal in mind: to reach the top of the Capitol steps. Their purpose: to achieve rights for disabled Americans. The Capitol crawl was seen as the most important event that led up to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was led by activists that were a part of an organization called ADAPT.
We're going to march until Congress starts listening to us. They're stalling the bill that's going to give us equal rights, and we aren't asking for civil rights. We're demanding them, and now.
Over 1,000 activists came to the Capitol on March 12, 1990, and crawled 83 stone steps to the top, demanding passage of the ADA, which would give rights to disabled Americans across the country. The ADA unofficially started many years before the Capitol crawl or any related protests took place, even decades before. Concerns about discrimination against disabled Americans started out unheard of in cities and towns around the US. But citizens began to notice the unfairness of how disabled people were treated by society.
Back in the 1800s, many states and municipalities passed ugly laws, what were known as ugly laws, i.e. if you looked different, you were not allowed to be on the public streets. You literally were to be out of sight and out of mind. And if you weren't, you were fined and incarcerated.
In addition to ugly laws, disabled women were sterilized involuntarily because they were seen as a burden on society. 33 states passed laws to sterilize people who were feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, blind, deaf, or crippled. In some states like Virginia, disabled people weren't allowed to marry. Even before these laws were in place, public opinion was slowly changing. When disabled veterans came back from World War I, Congress passed rehabilitation programs. Bigger and bigger steps were taken for the better. Returning blind veterans founded the American Foundation for the Blind. They wanted people to know that the blind were capable of living independent lives. Then, after World War II, returning veterans created another society fighting for independent living as well, the Paralyzed Veterans of America. In 1965, Medicaid started helping low-income and disabled people. In 1968, the first International Special Olympic Games were held in Chicago. In 1974, the last of the ugly laws were repealed. After many protests, in 1975, the law guaranteed a free, appropriate, and public education for all disabled children. But this wasn't enough for disability activists. They still lacked accessibility, faced job discrimination, and needed more protection and help to lead independent lives. ADAPT organized multiple protests, including protests in Canada. Wade Blank, the leader of this organization, helped organize the Capitol crawl. The hope was that this would bring attention to their cause and the act would be signed. Over 1,000 people gathered from 30 different states. Rallies and speeches were held throughout the day, leading up to the most important event.
The night before, they asked the volunteers to call steps. I thought it was a great idea. Some people were really against it. They thought that it would be really demeaning to see a bunch of disabled people crawling up steps, you know. So why not let them see some reality? And there was this little girl was right ahead of me, you know. And I said, oh my gosh, this little girl is she has cerebral palsy. This little girl is gonna climb up the steps ahead of me and I'm not gonna be able to make it. And she's gonna make me look really stupid. You know?
However, not everyone was comfortable with protesting.
I honestly don't know if I remember hearing about it. I know I heard about it afterward. I was not very comfortable with like the public demonstration kind of things. So I wasn't thinking that it was the best way to do it.
Is there like another way that you think would be better?
Well, I'm not a demonstrator type person.
Yeah.
So sitting down and talking with people probably does not work, but I would certainly want to try that first.
Yeah. The day after the Capitol crawl, some of the same activists went back to the Capitol, saying they were going to take a tour. However, it was only a way to get into the Capitol building itself. As more activists gathered, chants broke out and got louder and louder. Eventually, House Speaker Foley, Republican leader Mitchell, and Congressman Hoyer came to assure them that the ADA would be passed and they didn't need to protest anymore. About 4 months after the Capitol crawl, the ADA was signed. Finally, after years of protesting and even arrests, the activists could rest. On July 26, 1990, President Bush signed the act.
I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disability Act and say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
This day, the ADA prevents discrimination against disabled people, making jobs, schools, transportation, and public buildings and areas more accessible to fit disabled people's needs. So, what role does the ADA play in your job?
Came in and now you want to open up a store to sell clothes. There is no ADA or accessibility to that building, so it may dictate you have to put a ramp in so people with disabilities can use that ramp. You may have to put a ADA compliant bathroom in.
What's your opinion on the ADA?
I think it was something that was definitely due. The majority, I'd say 95% of it is very beneficial to people with disabilities.
The activists who took a stand during the Capitol crawl helped achieve the ADA, which still touches disabled people's lives today.
All right, thank you, Charlisa. We will have this for anyone who wants to see it. What I realize is playing this over this medium doesn't give it its full benefit. I think this young lady did an excellent job. And again, this was done some years ago. So without further ado, we will move into the COVID study overview. All right, so some of you may know that the Department of Disability Services put out a solicitation for a study. Next slide, please. And we were looking to determine the long-term effects, physical, psychological, of the pandemic on those with IDD who were positively diagnosed with COVID-19 and others who were not diagnosed but experienced negative outcomes due to isolation and or quarantine. Next. So we had the pleasure of working with a local CBE, that is a community-based enterprise, and the company's name is Wellcentric. We collaborated on the process of developing a standardized survey tool, which made up a total of 35 questions targeted and engaging the experiences of people during the pandemic. We wanted to be sure to capture the responses of more than 600 people who had tested positive for COVID during the start of the pandemic in March of '90 and looked at a 2-year period through March of 2022. The survey interviews and data collection, it began in October of 2022 and concluded in May of 2023. Next slide. So there were a total of 746 surveys conducted in one-to-one interviews, video conference, and telephone, either with the person, their circle of support, which included relatives, guardians, direct support staff. And the surveys were developed with the intent of being answered by the people supported, people served, but 85% of the responses came from natural supports or paid supports. And the previous, if you can go back to the previous slide, I think that's okay. And I do apologize, I meant to make this larger. So WellCentric took raw data and broke down the survey questions into 5 domains: information related to COVID, detection and prevention, impact of COVID on employment / career opportunities, and the impact on the regimen of care and individual health and autonomy. Next slide. And the 5 domains sort of in a clearer fashion written here. And next slide. And so the first domain was information related to COVID-19. It was reported that 96% of the respondents felt that they trusted the information that they were being told from or by their circle of support / healthcare workers. The second domain, detection and prevention, 65% of the respondents felt that they were taught the reason for the public health precaution recommendations and how to recognize the symptoms of COVID and prevention methods. Next. And the third domain, the impact of COVID on employment and career opportunities. 126 people served who were employed during the pandemic, or 34% of which, 45 people reported that their jobs had been impacted in some way. The fourth domain, impact of the regimen of care, is that 46% of the respondents reported that their regimen for care had changed, specifically those who attended day programs. 92% went on to state that they used COVID precautions while working, and which was a change for them. 92% reported no change in their ability to access regular health services, and 49% reported that their appointments had become virtual instead of in office. And then finally, the fifth domain, individual health and autonomy. 8% of the respondents felt depressed at some point during the pandemic. 25% reported feelings of isolation. And finally, 94% reported that they were hopeful about the ending of the pandemic. Next slide. So at the conclusion, we were provided with some recommendations, and immediately what I realized is that the recommendations were by and large in line with what we ourselves here had seen relative to reviewing this data and building the system to support people along the way as the pandemic unfolds. So what we had was, when services need to be reduced, ensure there are processes to reintroduce services with meaningful timeframes, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Prepare a booklet or other materials for DDS participants and their caregivers or support staff to ensure that there's an understanding of the specific instructions, the list of resources, signs and symptoms, and in the event of another public health emergency, start the process of conducting a survey earlier in the pandemic to determine the impact of the pandemic at its peak. This survey was conducted starting, and that's a typo, October of 2022 through May of 2023. And I will put my project manager, Angelica Ross's email address here for any questions that may be related specifically to this. And I'm just going to take a second to see if in the chat we have any questions so far. Looks like we don't have any. All right, and we can take questions along the way, but we are at a point where I would like to introduce one of our collaborators and colleagues that we work with, and that would be Sam Crane of the Quality Trust.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much. I was invited to come speak to you today about respectful language and use of respectful language in talking to people with disabilities and talking about people with disabilities, including intellectual and developmental disabilities, but really I'm trying to be very broad. This is relevant. Of course, DDS has published or issued for comments guidelines on respectful language, and I wanted to sort of give a disability advocacy perspective on what that respectful language can look like. I am a person with disability, including a developmental disability, and before coming to Quality Trust, I'm currently the legal director of Quality Trust. But before coming to Quality Trust, I was the legal director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, where we really focused on getting self-advocates involved in conversations about us. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I get into slideshow mode. So Quality Trust, as many of you know, conducts independent advocacy and monitoring for children and adults with disabilities. We focus on dignity, respect, and autonomy, including rights protection and helping people access decision-making supports. We run the Jenny Hatch. What?
I just wanted to let you know that you weren't in presentation mode in case you wanted to.
Let me just start it again.
I see her screen though.
My screen, it created a different screen. So now does that work?
There you go. Yes, there you go.
Okay. We run the Jenny Hatch Justice Project, which helps people access alternatives to guardianship, the National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making, and Family Ties of DC, a parent-to-parent matching program. We also do monitoring. So I wrote this before I realized that you had already had such an amazing presentation on the disability rights movement. But just to recap some of it, historical attitudes to disability were very paternalistic and charitable. And they really focus on people as the subjects of charity, the subjects of assistance. And this could lead to segregation and loss of autonomy for people with disabilities. The disability rights movements have challenged ideas of people with disabilities as helpless or as just recipients of charity. And that includes, it's been a long, long history of disability rights. The first the first self-advocacy organization made up of people with disabilities speaking for themselves was, Sean says that she's not seeing my slides move, which is a problem. Okay, now it's moving. It was the first people who were really speaking for themselves was in 1880 when the deaf community created the National Association of the Deaf. Right? They were challenging people who thought that deaf people should be segregated, excluded, that they shouldn't be allowed to use sign language. People were trying to teach deaf people to try and look more like hearing people by reading lips and teaching people to use their spoken speech instead of sign language, which was more natural to them. And they were like, we don't like this. We're going to create our own organization to advocate from our perspective. And then, we saw a blind community in 1940 create their own self-advocacy groups. And then, independent living movement, people first movement for people with intellectual disabilities, Mad Pride and psychiatric survivors movements, autistic self-advocacy movements also followed along. And so this is a slide that I hope I don't really have to tell people not to use these slurs. I'm going to really start with the very basics of respectful language. But it's important for us to understand that a lot of slurs that are now very offensive words to use for people with disabilities started with medicalized language and really eugenics movements. So in the early 20th century, people who believed that people with intellectual disabilities, people with other disabilities should be excluded, segregated, even forcibly sterilized, they would use a lot of these words. And so when you use a word like the R word, or words like the ones that I've written on the on this slide, which I don't even like to use myself, when people use those words, it's not just a word that's outdated or offensive, it's a word that has a long history of being used to justify harming people with disabilities. So that's why we really try and avoid these words. They were used to force us into institutions. They were used to force us to not be able to have children, etc. So instead of the R word, of course, you want to say intellectual disability. Instead of calling someone crippled, you want to say physically disabled or mobility impaired. Use psychosocial disability to talk about people with mental health diagnoses. And it's important to know that some people have reclaimed some of these slurs. Some people, for example, in the physical disability movement will use some slurs related to physical disabilities, but those aren't for us to use, right? If we're not in that community, we don't use it, it's offensive. You can't reclaim a word that is not describing you. But now I'm going to get into language changes that are less about just not using slurs and more about using language that recognizes our autonomy, our personhood, our dignity, right? And so these are things that maybe you didn't know were things that not to use, but we still don't want to use it because it does bother people with disabilities. And I'm going to start with language that's infantilizing. There's a long history again, because of this charitable model, there's a long history of people using words that compare people with disabilities, adults with disabilities, to children, or that compares people with disabilities who are minors to people who are younger than them. And it also can create misleading assumptions that if an adult with a disability is like a kid, then we don't have to treat them like an adult in terms of offering dignity and autonomy. So one really common, very frequently used phrase is saying that someone has a mental age of, let's say, 3 or 10 or 12, when that's not their actual age, right? If I'm in my 40s, my mental age is in my 40s because that's my age. And it doesn't matter what my abilities are, I am not younger than I am. Instead of calling someone having a mental age, you still want to say intellectual disability or developmental disability and give us a specific description of abilities and needs, right? A person might have pretty significant difficulty doing things that other people master at a younger age, right? So let's say a person is not speaking in full sentences, right? Non-disabled people start speaking in full sentences at a pretty young age. But just because this person isn't speaking in full sentences doesn't mean that his mental age or her mental age is 2 or 3. It means that they are a person with a disability who doesn't speak in full sentences. You can use specific skills that this person is still working on, or specific things that a person needs help on. We don't refer to adults as kiddos. I've seen that happen, and it's not something that you want people to do. You don't want to refer to adults as children. Like this person has a child who is 24. Okay, well, that might be their child in the sense that that this is their parent, but they're still an adult, and we want to use adult as much as person as possible. We don't want to use the word caretaker. Sort of makes people very passive, like they're being taken care of in a dependent role, and we instead say caregiver, right? We don't say that someone is dependent on supports. We try and avoid that term. Instead, we say the person uses supports, so that we can emphasize a person's autonomy and their role in choosing the supports that work for them. Another set of language concerns that we've run into is what I would call pity language, or language that denies a person's skills and capacities, emphasizes deficits. Wheelchair bound. Some people will say this person's wheelchair bound. Well, if you talk to someone who uses a wheelchair, they view a wheelchair as liberating. That wheelchair is what helps them go places. It's not necessarily a restriction to an individual who uses a wheelchair. So we use wheelchair user instead. Calling a person severely impaired, that can sound like you're really trying to emphasize a deficit. And as long as we're not, in a very medical context, we want to just say the person has significant support needs. We don't want to deny that a person needs a lot of supports. We don't want to deny a person's experience of disability, but we're going to focus on their support needs instead of a deficit, if that makes sense. Suffers from, it's another common phrase. Some things we do, if someone says they suffer from chronic pain, I think that does cause suffering, but a lot of disabilities are not something that we experience as suffering from, right? So I don't suffer from a developmental disability, I just have a developmental disability. So we say has instead of suffers from. We try and avoid words like incapacitated. Again, it makes it sound like the person doesn't have the ability to do anything, that they're passive, that we just need to do everything and to them instead of work with a person. So we say a person needs support for in certain activities, or if you're talking about a legal capacity determination, because the legal world still uses words like incapacitated, we want to just focus on that and say, oh, they don't have, a judge has found they don't have legal capacity to do this and this and this, so that it's not really about them and it's more about what their legal situation is. People who have communication disabilities have said that they really don't like the word nonverbal, since that often makes it sound like a person has no way of communicating at all, that they don't have it's that they don't have anything to say. So the preferred term is often non-speaking or requiring communication supports. And similarly, a lot of people don't like, for example, profound autism or profound intellectual disability. Again, significant support needs, or focusing on the specific thing that you're talking about. Oh, this person is non-speaking and autistic, or this person has an intellectual disability and is autistic, or this person is autistic and has these support needs. instead of using language that is very, focused on deficits. At the same time, we don't like to use overly euphemistic language either, because it's sort of the other side of the same coin about pity, right? If you see someone as an object of pity, maybe it might make you uncomfortable to acknowledge things about them, and you might be tempted to use a euphemism. And that euphemism still emphasizes that there's something wrong with directly describing a person, right? So if you say that a person is differently abled, for example, or something like that, that a lot of it can rub people the wrong way, because it's saying that there's something wrong with having a disability. There's something wrong with being thought of as disabled. Again, the disability community is not a monolith, but a lot of us really think of ourselves like it's okay to have a disability. That's part of who I am. That's part of my life. And so just use the word, please. It's as long as it's not a overly stigmatizing word or a word that's a slur, it's totally fine to just say that a person has a disability, is disabled, needs supports. Don't refer to people as the disabled as like a whole, as a group, right? Because again, that's sort of I was struggling to figure out whether I would call that a euphemism versus sort of just dehumanizing. But we're not all like a bunch of, we're not just a mass, right? We're a bunch of individual people who have different opinions and hopes and dreams. So instead of saying the disabled, you would want to say people with disabilities. Special needs is a frequent controversial term. I think sometimes I didn't want to put this in without a qualifier, but just be aware that a lot of people with disabilities do not like being referred to as special needs. A lot of parents still really prefer this language because they're focusing on their child's access needs. But for me personally, I would prefer to just be referred to as disabled or as needing or as having specific needs. You could say, this person has sensory needs, this person has communication needs, because sometimes it's hard for people to understand what exactly is being talked about when you just say special needs. My needs are not special, they're just different from some other people's needs. Trying to move to the next slide again. And then finally, I wanted to get to this because this is something that people ask about a lot. And it was the first thing that I think I was asked to talk about. I wanted to talk about the other language issues as well. But this is an active area of disagreement in the disability community about identity first versus person first language. And there are arguments both ways. So if you talk about identity first language, that's, let's say, disabled person or blind person, versus person first language, which would be person with a disability, a person with an intellectual disability. Identity first language, and here's the reason why people sometimes disagree with this. When people like identity first language, it's typically because the person has a positive identification with the community and the culture of their disability. And you see this, for example, a lot among the deaf community, for example, right? Deaf is a positive identity for many deaf people. it's a culture because of a shared language that deaf people have. When people like identity first language, it's often because they want to emphasize it. And they want to emphasize the similarity to other identity groups, right? I am a queer person, right? I am not a person with queerness. It is part of who I am. Person first language, on the other hand, is often a preference in reaction to dehumanization based on a person's diagnosis. And it's preferred to help emphasize a person's identity as a person first, again, like I am a person and then I just happen to have this disability. So please focus on my shared experience with people who don't have disabilities and understand that I also have this disability.
Excuse me,
What?
this is Thelma Green. I just want to let you know my internet was messing up, so I missed some of your program. So, but
I
I'm
think
here.
it's being recorded, right? Is there anything that I should repeat? Because I want to just finish this and then we can
No,
have.
you can go ahead. I just want to let you know that I didn't hear
Okay.
everything.
All right. Did anyone else's internet go out? It is being recorded, so hopefully we can have this out on the website.
Yeah,
Right,
it is
Andy?
being recorded, and I'm sorry for cutting you off.
Oh.
It is being recorded, and anyone can, once it's posted, can go back and review it.
Awesome. Thank you, Winslow. So while this can vary within some groups, a lot of the time I found that this is something that there's a little bit of community consensus on depending on the disability. And so I'm gonna kind of go to the next one. On the next slide, I'll talk about specific disabilities and general consensuses about person first versus identity first that people want to be aware of. But there's definitely variation inside this. So always when you're talking to a specific person, it's very good to ask about a person's individual preference. Because, for example, I'm an autistic person. I like to refer to myself that way, but some people prefer person with autism and so you wanna follow what a person's preferences are. So in general, these are, again, broad guidelines. You will see that people with some disabilities tend to prefer person first language. Intellectual disability and developmental disability is a very common, it's very common for people with these diagnoses and disabilities to really prefer person first language because it emphasizes personhood. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities have often been dehumanized and often been denied recognition of their personhood. So a person with an intellectual disability is generally how you should default. A person with Down syndrome, right? You don't say a Down syndrome person. That's generally not how you would want to do. A person with epilepsy, person with cystic fibrosis, cerebral palsy, mental health disabilities generally want person first language. Depression, a person with bipolar, a person with schizophrenia, a person with anxiety disorder. In a sort of specific situation, you might say a person who is experiencing psychosis instead of a person who is psychotic. That can be viewed as very stigmatized. So a person who's experiencing psychosis. And sometimes you can also say a person with access needs, right? A person who needs an interpreter, a person who needs a wheelchair ramp, etc. And you can say, I have an access. On the other hand, the autistic community tends to prefer identity first language. An autistic person Again, that is something with a little bit of variation, and some people prefer person with autism. Ask people what they prefer. A blind person, a deaf person, a person who is hard of hearing. Sometimes you can go both ways on that one as well. A non-speaking person, again, that's another one that you can say a person who's non-speaking. It really can go both ways. A little person, that's a person who, for one reason or another, there are a lot of different causes, reaches a height that is significantly lower than average typical height. So a person with dwarfism or such. Dyslexic, some people again say I have dyslexia or I am dyslexic, but that's one where you do see some people who really have a positive identity as I am dyslexic. Trauma survivors sometimes will use identity first language to emphasize the fact that I am a survivor. And again, similarly, people who use certain kinds of aids, like a wheelchair user, an ASL user, person, I'm trying to think of another example, cane user, will just say like, that can again go both ways, but you will see a lot of people who have that kind of positive identity and will use it as an identity first. So I want to open up for questions because I know I covered a lot and we don't have a whole lot of time. But if anyone has questions, please let me know, or you can always reach out to me at, I forgot to put on my email address, but it's scrane@dcqualitytrust.org.
Sam, I want to thank you for that very comprehensive yet not complicated presentation. And we will definitely ensure that it's posted for those who may need to refer back to it, because one of the things I'm realizing is that, you know, very nuanced training or information, I require review. I have to look at it over and over. So thank you again. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
That presentation. And we do have a couple of questions. And I will just thank everyone for the good mornings, the good afternoons, and blessings. Someone posted an incredible video. Thank you. We also have a comment, or, well, it looks like a comment. As an attorney who participates in ISP and other meetings for clients, I'm very concerned about professionals and other staffers who make fun of or laugh at their support needing individuals in residential facilities. And I am just going to type my contact information into the chat, because we do not tolerate any such behavior from anyone affiliated with our agency, contractors, or otherwise. And I will go out on a limb and say that if that is ever an experience, that any of my team members also share my disdain for that practice if it ever, you know, happens. So please reach out. And let's see, we have Sam Crane, that is SCRANE at DCQUALITYTRUST.org. That's Sam's email address. And then we have, thank you, Sam, for this insightful and helpful presentation, exclamation point. Sam, that was a great presentation, and thanks. Fantastic presentation. I will be sure to remember this information when providing new nurse orientation. Wonderful! Exclamation. Great presentation! Exclamation point. Great presentation! Exclamation point. Great. I'm gonna probably not repeat myself. This will
I'm
be the
feeling
last
good.
day.
Thank you, everyone.
Keep it coming, right? We do live in the right generation. An announcement went out. DDS is seeking input on the policy of respectful language. Comments are due August the 17th, and that comes from our State Office of Policy and Planning and Innovation Program Manager, Crystal Thomas, and we definitely welcome that input. Really informative presentation, Sam. Looking forward to pulling the recorded presentation from the Quality Trust website. When will it be available?
It's on our website.
Yeah, well, this presentation, the entire presentation will be loaded onto the dds.dc.gov website, and there's a section for forms, and if one of my colleagues can grab that and post it in the chat for me, there's a site where you can go and look at all previous forms, and we've been presenting these forms going into our 3rd year now, so by Wednesday of next week. Great presentation, great presentation. Good afternoon, Ms. Sinowitz. Please share details so that the agency can investigate.
Was paid for 72 hours, and the time it was late.
I'm sorry, can everyone mute their phones, please? I mean, phones, computers. Good afternoon, Ms. Sinowitz. Please share details so that the agency can investigate the behaviors. I wholly agree with Winslow that these are unacceptable. Many things that come from Mark Back, our general counsel. Thank you. We will use this as a company-wide training. All right. And the website for the presentations, it is DDS space COVID-19 Community and Provider Forums, and that's located at DDS. DDS.
Hey, Malaki, the paper I gave you for this.
Sorry, can you please mute your phone, your computer? And then click on that. Yeah, you can click on this in the chat to get the website, but I was just reading in case someone needed me to. So we could move on to our next presenter, and we will be moving to unwinding of companion services. So thanks again, Sam. We'll be in
Thanks,
touch.
everyone.
And so I would like to introduce to you Musu Fofana, who is the Program Manager of Service Plan and Coordination. Take it away, Musu.
Good morning, everyone. I should be sharing my screen at this point. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So, and this is a good segue from what Deputy Director Woodland shared about Disability Pride Month and what it means for the people that we work with. And so at this time, we want to talk about what you can expect from your service coordination team members as we approach the end of the public health emergency. So the federal public health emergency ended on May 11th. And with the end of the federal public health emergency, the flexibility of using Companion will also be ending. This flexibility remains in effect for 6 months until November 11th, 2023. And therefore, what service coordinators will be doing is working with people supported and their families to help transition them into community-based day supports and to help transition them all employment-based supports consistent with their identified needs and preferences. So why are we undertaking these activities? So DDS wants people supported to reconnect with their communities, to have a smooth transition to day programs or employment services, and when feasible and practical, to utilize technology to promote inclusion and self-determination. What did Companion look like prior to the public health emergency? So Companion services could only be included in a person's ISP after the team had considered the appropriateness of other waiver services, such as day help, employment readiness, individualized day, and supported employment. As we come to the end of the public health emergency, these are the activities that you should be expecting from your service coordinators. First, service coordinators will work with interdisciplinary teams to schedule meetings to discuss the return to either day rehabilitation, individualized day, employment readiness, or supported employment services. And they will amend the ISPs as appropriate. People supported and their support team may decide to transition to full-time services immediately, or within an alternative timeframe, as long as the duration of companion services falls within the following limits. Full-time companion services, that is 5 days per week, 8 hours a day of companion, will be considered the most integrated setting for people who meet the following criteria: people who are retired, people who previously had 5 days a week of companion authorized prior to the public health emergency and wish to continue to engage in 5 days a week of companion, people with a documented health or medical reason that prevents them from engaging in other day or employment services. For all others, companion services will be authorized according to the following schedule and criteria. Starting May 11th, companion will not be authorized for more than 3 days a week unless the team has considered other waiver services. Beginning on August 11, companion will not be authorized for more than 2 days a week unless the team has considered other waiver services. And on the date that the public health emergency ends, which is November 11th, 2023, companion services will not be authorized unless the team has considered other services. And the only exceptions are the people that I mentioned on the aforementioned slide. So what is DDS doing to make sure that people are aware of these changes and that they have advance notice of them? So there have been multiple presentations at community and provider forums dating back to, I believe, November of last year on the unwinding plan. There were presentations that were done at the DDS provider fair, which included stakeholders, people supported, their families. We had providers at that fair.
I didn't think of that.
I'm sorry. Transmittals have been sent to DDS providers. DDS is sending letters to people supported, their families, their guardians, and advocates to notify them about this change. And service coordinators are communicating this with people supported, their teams, and their families during IDT meetings and case conferences. And I just added this picture just to remind us of what meaningful day looks like. We have providers that have people going out in the community now. The objective is to ensure that people are really fully engaging with their community to the extent possible. And what service coordinators will do is to really look at what people are doing during the day. Progress notes will need to reflect meaningful day for people. And those the activities that people engage in need to be consistent with their likes and dislikes, their preferred activities as noted on their person-centered and discovery tools. Now, if you have any questions regarding unwinding from the public health emergency, for people supported, please contact your assigned service coordinator. If you cannot reach your assigned service coordinator, there are multiple people in service coordination that you can reach out to. I have the names of our supervisors. You can reach out to any of the program managers. So this is the service coordination management team. You can reach out to any of these individuals. Our email addresses are the first name dot the last name at dc.gov. And at this point, I will pause for questions. Thank you.
So we have a statement from DDS transmittal. This is companion services places restrictions that do not exist in the waiver regulations. The regulations do not require a health or medical to receive companion services or limit the number of days to the degree that the transmittal does. Companion services may be the most appropriate service for reasons other than a health or medical need. And I just want to say that the purpose of the transmittal and the unwinding, I think it's to be clear that people who did not receive companion services prior to the public health emergency were afforded that service through flexibilities in our Appendix K request from the federal government. And secondly, that providers who were not previously authorized to provide the service were given the flexibility to be able to provide the service. And thirdly, the staff that were used by some of those same providers were not. So in other words, there were flexibilities because there were staffing issues, there were issues with people coming into people's homes. And what the transmittal was seeking to do, or the whole unwinding is seeking to do, is to ensure that once the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services says, you cannot provide this service, you cannot use this provider, you cannot use this staff. We didn't want to wait until the very end to say, tomorrow you can't do this anymore. We wanted to planfully sort of scale back. And in addition to scaling back, we also wanted to allow day providers who would otherwise most completely shut down the opportunity to rehire staff and get their infrastructure back up to par to support the influx of people who would no longer be able to receive companions. So it seems as though the question is that we are putting restrictions on the number of days. We're not. That's not the intent of the transmittal. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I'd be glad if you could come off mute if I didn't touch it well enough or explain it well enough.
Yeah, this is Sandy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I mean, if going through where it says from this state to this state, then you can get it for this number of days, and then you can get it for 2 days. That's not consistent with the regulations. The regulations don't say that. They say that you can get it for 8 hours a day if it's determined to be appropriate when considering other waiver services. So that's where I'm talking about the restriction on days. And in terms of the other point where the list of 3 and the third one being that you had to show a health or medical need to show that it's more appropriate than the other waiver services, that's not a requirement that's in the regulations prior to the pandemic. I understand via practice that companion services were not provided prior to the pandemic the way that they're provided now, but the regulations do not, the regulations do not place the restrictions that you are now placing through what the provider transmittal states that I saw and what you just listed as your number 3 about the health and medical need. It may be appropriate for other reasons. It might be that you need them on the weekends because you're busy during the week. And so therefore that's the most appropriate service, or that you were getting companion services. And it turns out that that is, been much better. It's provided you with, much more joy in your life than it did going to a day hab program. So, I mean, there are other reasons other than a health or medical need is my point.
And if I may, Winslow and Sandy, what we're doing here is, what is in the waiver rules is that companion services will only be authorized after the IDT has considered other waiver services. So what we're saying is when you talk about retirees and people with a documented health condition, what it basically means is for these people, the companion services will automatically be reauthorized. But for the others, there will need to be a conversation because we need to make sure that the person continuing to receive companion is consistent with their identified needs and assessed preferences, and that it continues to afford them a meaningful day. And so if that wasn't clear during the presentation, I want to make sure that that's really clear. If people don't fall into those 3 criteria, if they're not retirees, if they were not receiving companion prior to the pandemic 5 days a week, or if they don't have a documented health condition, the service coordinator will need to have a meeting with that person and their circle of support to look at what they're doing during the day, to make sure that those activities are meaningful for the person, and to ensure that the team does consider the appropriateness of other waiver services first.
Yeah, and I don't debate that you should consider other waiver services, as you should with any service when the person decides that they want to exploring other options. My concern is, especially with that third prong saying that they have to prove a health or medical need, that is not in the regulations. So therefore it's not in your CMS waiver application either. So I do still feel that there are additional requirements now being placed that are more restrictive in the regulations, which is really not permitted. And I know we probably aren't going to have a debate on, this forum with 135 people, but that is my position.
And with interpreters trying to keep up with you as you speak and try to get so many points in so quickly.
I'm sorry, I talk fast.
There are lots of questions, Musu. I don't know if you could see the chat now that you're not presenting anymore. Could you walk through those questions with people?
Yes, certainly. Yes. So I think the first one I see is, okay, we already responded to Sandy, and then Robin Schaefer. Can you please provide more information on what it means for the IDT to have considered other services? So service coordinators will sit down with the person and look at what they're doing during the day, look at their person-centered discovery tools, the same that they should be doing with other services really, except that in this case, they will have a special planning meeting just to talk about companion and to make sure that those services, what they're doing during the day is consistent with their needs and their preferences. They'll look at the companion schedule. They will look at the companion quarterly. They will speak with the companion staff. They will talk to the person or the person's decision maker. And at that point, as a team, they will determine what makes sense for that person to ensure that that person is having a meaningful day. I don't know if that answers your question, Robin. It does. And then Iris Clark asks, what documents are needed to process SFA for ICF, because service coordinators request for different documents. Like some ask for the ICF contracts while others ask for the ISP documents, and some do not ask for anything. So, Ms. Clark, I may need you to come off to mute yourself and actually clarify this question, because the SFA is really where we change the person's address in the system. So I'm not sure what is being requested here, or If you could send me an email or reach out after this meeting, I'm gonna need some more clarity around that question. Because in order to process an SFA, a service coordinator just needs to know the address that the person is going into. And I don't know if you're talking about processing level of care. I'm not sure about that question. And then the second question is it okay for the day program to provide companion services to people supported in the day program? Some people supported cannot do IDS because it is not right for them, but companion seems to be better because they still want to come to the day program. So companion services cannot be provided concurrently with DayHab. So I don't know if the question is, can people be authorized for DayHab and still receive companion services in the day setting? But again, I mean, if the question is, can the person be in the day program and be authorized for companion services? Again, I'm going to just say that the two services cannot be provided concurrently. Also, please share the answers to these questions with all service coordinators and waiver specialists. We're definitely having conversations with our team members around the service. Yes, the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the website. How long does it take for DDS to process the medical documentation once submitted? Will companion services remain in place during this process until the medical documentation is approved? So to be clear, I mean, I think a lot of our folks that have medical issues, I think that's already reflected in their level of need scores. We already have the documentation in place. And so the expectation is that the interdisciplinary team is already aware about the person's medical needs, except for people who are coming into services for the first time. So I do believe that for most of the people, we may not need to go through the process of obtaining additional medical information to substantiate their need for 5 days a week of companion, particularly if they were already receiving that prior to the public health emergency. And the next question, can people in natural homes use companion services without having the medical or retirement need? Not everyone in a natural home is looking for the type of services that would fall under in-home supports. And that's a very good point. Again, that's a conversation that needs to occur within the context of the IDT. What is important is that people are engaged during the day, that they're engaging with their community, whether it be virtually or in person, they're engaging in fitness activities, they're going out in the community. I think what we want to prevent is people just being home, not doing anything, maybe spending the whole day watching TV. I think for a lot of the younger people that we support, that definitely doesn't represent a meaningful day. And so we want to make sure that we promote inclusion. And yes, I do agree that some people may not be appropriate for in-home supports and companion may work better for them. But again, there has to be a conversation at the team level. Let me see if there are any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. So I wrote in the chat in reference to the medical documentation of the exceptions. You listed 3 exceptions, and one of them was the medical documentation. So for families that came into DDS during the pandemic, so they aren't aware as to how DDS operated or proceeded prior to the pandemic. During the pandemic, if a family received companion care or companion support, they have submitted, if they submit medical documentation, how long does it take DDS to review that documentation? And during that review process, does companion support remain in place?
Yes, companion support does remain in place during that review process. Similarly, also for people who are transitioning to other day services, there's going to need to be an intake meeting, a planning session. So companion services will remain in place during that timeline. What the service coordinator will need to do, though, is document the duration of companion on the plan of care And so, the end date, the duration of companion once the IDT has met maybe for another 30 days or, to allow the team to kind of plan that transition. But yes, companion will remain in place during that transition period. And the duration of that period will be documented in the ISP so that it's clear to everyone.
Okay. And for clarity, how long is that review process? What is the time frame? Would it be 14 to 60 days, or how long does that actual review process take?
The review process for the medical documentation, I think it really shouldn't take more than a week or so, because unless there's a need for additional information or what is supported is not clear, but it really shouldn't take that long to review that documentation. To the extent that information is submitted to the service coordinator and it's complicated and they may need additional supports, the service coordinator will reach out to health and wellness. We will encourage the service coordinators to provide notice to the team if it's going to take longer than a week for the information to be reviewed within DDS.
Thank you.
At the same time, we want to make sure there's no interruption in services. And so those authorizations will remain in place until the person transitions to the appropriate day support.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So I just wanted to say that there are a few questions in the chat. It's 1:26. We're going to try to get to all of these, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't miss them. So there is a question that is, can people in natural homes use companion services without having a medical or retirement need ? Not everyone in natural homes are looking for the types of services that will fall in under in-home supports. And what I will say is that was asked and answered. So the answer to that question is yes. However, I don't want to miss an opportunity to educate those who don't know and remind those who do that the settings rule requires that the agency work diligently to provide services and supports in what is described as the least restrictive, most integrated setting possible. And to that extent, we want to make sure that people are engaged with their respective communities as much as possible. And Companion, when it was offered, was very niche, and it was for people who otherwise had exhausted all other opportunities and just didn't want to work, didn't want to participate in individualized day treatment, or did not want to attend a day habilitation setting. So our first job is to make sure that people have every opportunity to engage with their respective communities without restrictions, that anyone who wants to work or engage respectively outside of their homes or any type of setting gets an opportunity to do that. So I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that. And it sounds like we may have to have on this forum a presentation on the settings rule. There's a question, will this be the only opportunity for questions? Absolutely not. I put my contact information in the chat. Any service coordinator or manager that you have a relationship with, if you ask them a question and you feel as though they aren't giving you the answer that you need, or that they themselves may need support in explaining something to you, we have a chain that, and my director always says, if you call a service coordinator and they don't get back to you in a day, you should be calling their supervisor, because their name should be on that recording. They don't call you back. In other words, 5 days you will be at the director, and you won't ever get the director if you call me, and I can promise you that, because he doesn't like to get calls if they come to me and I haven't answered them. So good afternoon. Oh, I'm sorry. As a day provider, many day program participants who receive day habilitation has 1 day of companion to offset the 24 hours, a week regulation. Many participants opt to have this service as the day program opposes to the home as they prefer to stay with their friends for the most meaningful day for them. As we bring in new participants, some service coordinators are declining the companion and asking for IDS. However, IDS may not be conducive to the person's needs. Please inform if the 1 day of companion is an issue in cases as such. I'm going to ask that you reach out to me because of time constrictions, but it sounds like unpacking that may take longer than 1 or 2 sentences. But I will generally say that the driver of any service is not what a provider thinks someone needs. And I'll just make that as a general statement. Robin Shafford says, thank you. Tiffany says, also, I thought companion could be used for retired people who wanted to be afforded recreational and leisure activities in the home or in the community, not necessarily connected to health. That is absolutely correct. As was stated, the health issue is just specifically related to the unwinding of the public health emergency. I will send an email for question 1, and I believe that was the question related to the ICF. Okay, wait a minute. Additional resource to supporting families, community of practice is looking for feedback on the priorities and preferences of families that include a person with IDD-DD. If you haven't already, please share your voice so that we can plan outreach sessions and events that reflect family priorities. And that comes from Catherine Reinhardt Mello of our State Office of Policy Planning and Innovation. And Catherine, if you could put in the chat quickly a way that people can reach out to you if they have need to participate in supportive families, community of practice. And just in general, that's a great opportunity for families who have concerns relative to services and supports in other areas as they support their family members. And we would strongly encourage that. And Catherine is given her email address is CATHERINEHARTMELLO That's Catherine Reinhardt Mello at DC.gov. And there's a flyer she's posted. Look, folks, this has been great. A lot of energy. I want to thank all of our presenters and all attendees, family members, and community-based advocates and my team here for a great presentation. Our next meeting is scheduled for August the 20th. I wrote it down. August the 25th at the same time. And and again, does someone have a question, or is that just something come off me? All right. Well, at this point, I just want. Hold on. 1 second. Okay, there's a link here. If people want to click onto it for the flyer, and I'll give you a second if you want to grab the last item in the chat to click on the flyer related to the supporting families and community practice. Before we close again, I want to thank everyone for coming, and we will see you August the 25th. And please, any questions or concern, please reach out to the department and we'll address them as soon as possible. Thank you. Bye.